Last time, we talked about how the master slave relationship works and how the slave sees benefit in accepting the lordship of the master. That is because it allows the slave to partake of his master's glory. The master accepts the position of lordship because of his willing spirit trying to prove itself and thus choosing a position of excellence. You see it all the time, especially in fans of a particular sports star who themselves feel happy or sad or have their worth established based on the performance of the object of their admiration, who in turn gains the recognition of his excellence by acceptance of his fans. Today, however, we will read Hegel in his own words. Whatever I told you in these videos does not make sense if I do not introduce you to what Hegel himself wrote, so you can be a judge for yourself about how he framed this dialectic. There are various ways of analyzing Hegel's words. We will do it by considering a situation in which one self-conscious being comes into contact of other self-conscious being. In a chapter titled Lordship and Bondage in Hegel's work Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel talks about the master-slave relationship. We will look at the English translation by J. P. Belly. The translation is merely for reference purposes, so the problem it possesses, if any, are irrelevant to the discussion as it does not form the crux of the Hegel's view as outlined in the video. Yet the presence of it allows the viewers of this video to get a hold of the actual content and how it was written by Hegel, while simultaneously allowing them to find the references in the actual German work itself or other translations as the case may be. The chapter starts by Hegel making an unequivocal assertion about self consciousness, that it exists in itself and for itself. That is pretty understandable. The whole point of self consciousness is to be contained in self. It is not dependent on the other for its existence. It exists for itself in the sense that it is about itself. The consciousness is directed towards the existent self. The second part, however, where Hegel says that it exists for another self consciousness, is puzzling because it seems to contradict Hegel's first assertion. But it does not, because it is about self consciousness realizing its own existence by presence of another, which recognizes its existence. That is to say, that without any other being present, to recognize the existence of the first self consciousness is almost as good as non existent. This form of epistemology puts Hegel at a different position than other Western philosophers, for example, the scholastics, and follows from his idealistic leanings. If the effect of existence of something and the actions emanating thereof is not felt by any other thing, it is almost as if the first thing did not exist, or if it did, was completely inert. However, here, even a complete acceptance of idealism is not required. The concepts like beauty, morality, serenity, all abstracts like that seek recognition for their truth to be evident. What is use of morality, for example, if no one ever knows it to exist? Similarly, consciousness, if it is not material, must be recognized for its existence to be meaningful. Thus, when this self consciousness must meet another one, it must feel jubilated. However, facing another person puts the consciousness in existential jeopardy. The self conscious sees the consciousness in another person, yet still the other person is an object of consciousness for him. The consciousness is seeing a being who is actually a subject himself, but is an object of consciousness. This paradox causes an existential strife in the self conscious. If I am self conscious and I am here, who is there? Of course, it is another person who has self consciousness, but his self consciousness is directed to himself and not to me, like my self consciousness. This inherent problem of the nature of subject object distinction causes the conscious to become confused in a Hegelian sense. The consciousness experiences two things. First, it seems to believe that part of its own self has been lost to other person because now there are two people having the self consciousness. Secondly, it believes that the other consciousness is part of itself, or it is the same thing as itself, and thus must have the same identity. To establish certainty of its own existence, the consciousness has to do two things. Firstly, it has to see the other consciousness as part of itself, because then it would be sure that it is the being of which the other is part, and then it sublates its own self into the other, because by the same reasoning, the self's own actions must be justifiable in presence of the other, if it is one complete self. The real self is the one self with which one identifies. Everything important the consciousness possesses must be contained in the expression of self then. The other being then must comprise of the unessential part of the consciousness, because the essential must lie with the one who is prominent. The non prominent thus appears an antithesis to the prominent. He is a threat to existential self, for his prominence makes self realize that he is not the one who is prominent. This is the life and death struggle Hegel talks about. It is not about actual life or death per se, but about the act of sublation and the act of being sublated. In either case, one's consciousness must lose identity in the other. While we often miss it, often we are put to the test ourselves, in which we figure at each point of controversy, why do others believe in opinions different than us? Sometimes we accept our mentality is wrong and is merely an ignorant part of their mentality. Sometimes the opposite is the case. In either case, we try to establish certainty by act of rejecting ourselves or affirming the self that we embody. Hegel argues, then, the inevitability of the dilemma and eternity of it by showing how the very life and death struggle defeats the recognition of certainty in one's own self existence. The one who survives, or the one who successfully sublates the other, is again left without anything to prove its consciousness to, and thus becomes apprehensive of reality of his consciousness. The one who dies or gets sublated obviously loses its sense of self and is now dependent on the other for its own sense, without first hand knowledge of whether the other is alive. The latter is more easy to understand. To understand the first, imagine the consciousness as a ray of light. The ray of light is invisible until it is reflected off something, and then the light becomes known with certainty to exist. Without an external object, the existence of light cannot be certified, for its properties are known via interaction with what is not light. While from our perspective, as a third person, the two consciousnesses did fire each other, and thus both must be alive, for both acted and reacted, enacting two features of the living. For them, the struggle kills their own identity, for it is subsumed in the other and becomes doubtful. For their interaction results in sublation, which causes more confusion as both the consciousness become far apart from each other to maintain their ground. You see this in the case of a battle of ideologies. As the ideologies shift to more and more extreme positions in order to maintain the principles they are based on, differentiating themselves in their struggle on several points of interest to maintain their independent existence. The one who in this struggle realizes that his life is eternal and consciousness indestructible becomes the master with independence, for his existence, he realizes, is not dependent on the other. It is self evident and necessary. The other, by adopting a position far apart from the master, adopts the position of the slave and the position of dependence. His existence is for the other and not for himself. This completes the formation of the master and the bondsman and is the essence of what is known as the Hegelian dialectic.